Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online Adolescence Psychology class, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in schools. This chapter is or leans very heavily in kind of like the history of school, schooling policy. So you're really going to see here how important kind of the structure of school, those macro policies, and just whatever Bronfenbrenner speaking macro systems are, and kind of historical eras are throughout this chapter, which I'm sure you are reading. With that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with some basic definitions, secondary education defined as middle schools, junior high schools, and high schools. Almost all U.S. American adolescents are enrolled in school. In 1930, only half of adolescents were students. In 1900, only 1 in 10 adolescents were students. Adolescents spend more days in school each year. In 1920, about 162 days were spent in school. By 1968, about 180 days were spent per year in school. Adolescents remain in school for more years than in previous eras. In 1924, less than 33% of adolescents graduated high school. Today, about 85%. Enrollment in secondary education varies across the world, depending on kind of wealth resources within a given country. So again, here you can see historical era matters because as we've kind of progressed through the 20th century, more adolescents are spending more of their developmental period in school, more days per year, I should say, and also more total years. And as we've talked about throughout this class, kind of the rise of not just adolescence or the concept of teenagers, but also schools really begin to take off, specifically secondary education, in between the mid to like late 1800s all the way up through the 20th century. This coincides with industrialization, which we've already talked about. Need specially trained, more skilled workers. Worker pressure for union labor protection significantly decreased child labor in the U.S. Urbanization, mass movement from rural areas to cities, typically haphazardly. There's poor housing, overcrowding, and crime, supervised kids to keep them out of trouble, and immigration fears. Fears that immigrants weren't quote-unquote American enough. So we talked about industrialization, this massive accumulation of capital in industrial form, wherein you kind of need more skilled workers, specifically trained workers to work basically on an assembly line or kind of like an industrial line. At the same time, kind of pressure from unions, workers' rights actions to kind of adjust the child labor laws. Historically, there are very little child labor laws, and many children are frankly dying in factories and kind of like butcher houses and all those kind of things. This also contributed to getting children out of like a butcher shop, assembly line, and into the classroom. So maybe child safety, but at the same time, decreasing the amount of workers in the workforce as well. At the same time, with urbanization going alongside kind of industrialization, wherein we're moving out of those rural areas to cities. That is where the jobs are. That is where capital is accumulated. That is where you can quote unquote chase the American dream. But this is kind of done haphazardly with kind of poor housing, overcrowding, and crime. This is especially the case in the beginning of the 20th century, when there's kind of less like regulation of like housing and all those kind of things. And I don't remember if I mentioned it so far, but a fun little thing to do is look up the impact of lead on crime, the rates of lead that exist in automobiles and paint that kids would just eat and you're just breathing in all the time. The impact of ingesting lead or like being surrounded by lead is correlated, I should say, with increased levels of violent crime. You should look into that. There's kind of a big theory of the impact of lead on crime. Immigration, so at the same time, there's kind of just a different variation of 20th century fear of immigration, of immigrants who are not going to act quote-unquote American enough or whatever. So you have to send them to school to make sure that they receive proper cultural training. And I've talked about this before, but before compulsory secondary education, high schools were for the wealthy, powerful elite. By the 1920s, educators reformed curriculums to meet the needs of a diverse and growing population of young people. It focused on practical education, such as preparation for work and citizenship, presented as necessary part of Americanization. And then comprehensive high school, general education, college preparation, and vocational education, all housed under one roof. So kind of the idea, again, 1920s, we need to educate, create citizens socialize citizens to be able to participate in this new industrializing country. At the same time, we've already talked about like the cultural fears, kind of classic thing that exists. But then eventually what happens is this comprehensive high school model happens where we're getting kind of a generalized education for everyone. Again, trying the idea here is that you have to have certain standards to participate in a society. So let's have a general education, while at the same time housing college prep, which eventually came things like being able to take like college courses in high school or courses that count towards college credit, and also at the same time maybe doing vocational education, so like wood shop class, maybe home ec, those kind of like specific things that may be translatable over to like immediate construction jobs or something like that after high school, after a student graduates from high school. Continuing on with school reforms, during COVID-19 pandemic, maintaining the academic side of school was only one consideration. Schools provide breakfast and lunch to impoverished students. They provide extracurricular activities to help keep students supervised during the afternoon. And schools are important tools for social intervention. So kind of stopping here for a moment, schools should be understood as kind of like hubs of the community, fairly and unfairly. We give a lot of responsibility to schools and frankly ask them to solve problems that we're going to get to research suggesting that really are not problems that they can themselves fix. Like a teacher is not just going to all of a sudden fix this child's entire background. Now, but they do though are tasked with providing a lot of services. So free food and free lunch, for example, or reduce income, reduce lunch. So I had free lunch, I had free breakfast growing up. So it's like for low income students, having that access to food is like necessary. During COVID, obviously, less opportunities to do so, which can be challenging, obviously. So how do you handle this? Extracurricular activities, so just not immediate schooling, but socialization in peer groups, in cooperative activities or whatever competitive activities, and at the same time, it's used for social intervention. You see children every day, so theoretically, you have access to them and can work with them. If you have the resources to do so as a school. Or like a community, and then target interventions to that student's needs. Because theoretically, it's a place that the student has to go to every single day. Which brings us to law of the 1990s, No Child Left Behind, it was really promoted then initially. The law mandates that all states ensure that all students, regardless of economic circumstances, achieve academic proficiency on standardized annual tests. Schools that repeatedly fail face losing funds. And closing, school promotion. Promoting students from one grade to the next automatically regardless of their school performance. So kind of the idea, no child left behind, kind of a little self-explanatory. What we're going to do here is going to give standardized tests to all schools, basically. And what we're going to say is, okay, the schools who has students who aren't meeting X benchmarks, you have now lost funding and maybe we will close schools. And or target teachers who are whatever responsible or something along those lines. We'll get into what actually happened with this program. How did it actually turn out, this idea? And then we have this idea of social promotion. Kind of the idea is that, as we talked about before, there's age segregation in schools. But then the question is like, okay, what happens to students who aren't performing at the same level of their peers? And kind of the idea here of No Child Left Behind was like, oh, we're just moving these kids along, which is disproportionately impacting, it's going to be racial minorities, disabled people, poor people. So what can we do, I guess, incentively to stop this this kind of people kind of just falling through the cracks, but still advancing to the next grade? And that solution for No Child Left Behind is standardized testing and then penalizing schools who don't meet some criteria. And then here's a study that came out pretty recently about No Child Left Behind from out of Harvard. They found over the last decade, 0 to modest positive effects on student achievement in the targeted subjects math and English. Common Core had a negative effect on student achievement in non-targeted subjects such as science and social science studies, and we'll touch on Common Core momentarily. This negative effect is largest for underprivileged students, exacerbating racial and social and economic student achievement gaps. Other critiques: not enough resources, teaching to the test, subjects and skills not on the test are risk of being cut or ignored, impossible to assess critical thinking through standardized tests. So what we found here is that, oops, it really didn't work. And in fact, it actually negatively impacted some subjects, such as particular sciences and social sciences, or social studies. And not only that, but those negative effects were disproportionately in the theoretical targets of this program in the first place, to again improve that social promotion or stop that practice. Well, it turns out the negative effects of No Child Left Behind impacted those same groups, such as racial minorities, lower class students, disabled, etc. Other critiques of No Child Left Behind include, as I stated, kind of really just the classic, you're teaching to a test, you really don't care about other skills, you're just trying to blind memorize standardization, and is this really kind of a measurement of critical thinking? But all these kind of things here, again, because they're structural and they're like macro political, they're political issues. So thus there is a debate about what is the appropriate structure of schools, how to assess student performances, with all kind. It does kind of like a pedagogical and ideological question in many regards. Then we have the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. In 2015, Obama signed the ESSA, which is basically just built on top of, it's stacked on top of the now No Child Left Behind by Bush. It stressed the need to, quote, have high standards for all students. It stressed the need for a common set of standards across all 50 states. The framing of this was called Race to the Top. It was competition-based, which had no more impact on high school students' achievement than No Child Left Behind. Encourage schools to develop better ways to evaluating teachers, helping teachers to improve their classroom skills, and replacing poor teachers with better ones. So again, you can see how it's kind of built on No Child Left Behind, very much built on standardized testing and identifying schools/teachers who are underperforming and then doing something about that. In this case here, theoretically, giving the schools who achieve the most some kind of grants and stuff like that so they can improve. And again, what the studies have found is that, again, it had really no more impact on high school achievement and those among student groups, adolescent groups that were already struggling. Which brings us to Trump and Davos, or Davos, I always forget how you say their name, who focused on giving parents more ability to, quote, choose their child's school. They wanted to encourage schools to improve by competing for students. Government-funded education vouchers for use at conventional, charter, private, including religious, schools. Critics of this approach argued it would drain money from public school districts and create wider gaps in quality between schools for affluent children and schools for poor children. Biden's team focused on reopening schools as the COVID pandemic began to wane, then turned attention to counteracting Trump's educational initiatives and close the achievement gaps, again, between the poor, between adolescents in lower class and racial minority groups. So we had like this school choice kind of thing, which has kind of existed for like 50 years, kind of like the newest version of that, wherein theoretically you get like a voucher or something and then you apply to, and you just use it to any school you want. And I guess apply to those schools and you can get in. Some critiques of this include that basically those schools will just cherry pick the good, the best schools will cherry pick the highest performing schools and kind of not pick disadvantaged students or students with disabilities, something along those lines. So thus basically you have just like super mega schools of all like the best students, quote unquote the best students, highest performing ones, the already high performing students, and then you dump out the lower performing students, the most at need students, into like other either lower quality schools or just leave them in public education. And then thus the widening of that gap. And then we have this Biden situation wherein, we got to reopen the schools after COVID. And again, we're going to try and target lower class and racial minority students, disabled students to kind of improve their outcomes. So again, you can see here the impact, because again, all this, so much of adolescence and like socialization is socially based, aka we create these structures that kind of shape development. This is will be an ideological question and kind of like a political hot topic. Then we move on to debates about what schools should teach. Well said. Standard-based reform, policies designed to improve achievement by holding schools and students to a predetermined set of standards measured by achievement test. Common Core, proposed set of standards in language arts and mathematics of all American schools would be expected to use. It's U.S. American. Difficult to establish the standards. What should you know and shouldn't know? Problems with a large proportion of high school seniors do not pass standardized graduation exams. Incentives for making lower students. Economic, social, and political costs of holding back large number of students. So as I've stated before, we're kind of like in this era of like standardized kind of tests, and we want to standardize everything and then have students kind of meet those predetermined standards. And but then the question is, okay, what should those standards be? What should we teach? What should you know? And thus, by consequence, because time and energy is finite, you know, the students aren't in school 24/7. Even if they were, you'd have to make choices. You have to say, okay, what do we teach and what do we not teach? Again, this will be an argument for ideological reasons. An obvious one would be something like, when should you teach a foreign language? It really, developmentally speaking, like developmental psychology, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to first introduce students to a foreign language when they're like 16 to 18 years old. That's the sensitive period. What the first sensitive period of language development is like very early on. So theoretically, you should do it in elementary school. But again, this is not just a developmental, what is the best outcome, but it's also an ideological question. And not only that, the question then is like, okay, so say students don't meet that standards, should you just fail them? Maybe, maybe not. What happens though if you end up failing 25, 30% of the student population? Is that great? Is that worse? Do they have the funds to even keep those students? Is that better or worse for the students? Better or worse for the schools, their peers? There are economic and social costs associated with that. So schools are basically caught in a tough situation where it's like, okay, these things really, as you can see, this Harvard study, aren't really working. There are issues beyond the immediate school. These kids, neighborhoods, poverty, wealth, racial discrimination against them, stress in their life, stress in their parents' life. Who knows? All kinds of other just sets of limited social and kind of economic resources. So it's like, okay, well, we're just a school, we can't do anything about it. So, but what can we do about that, given that these reforms haven't really done much? Some have been negative, and that reality does exist outside of the school. So what do we do about it? And that is the question. Which brings us to inner city public schools. About 10% of U.S. high schools produce 50% of dropouts. 1/3 of Black and Latino U.S. students attend these schools. Race gap in achievement is nearly identical to what it was in the 1960s. Fewer than 20% of U.S. students are proficient in science. About 61% of Asian, 43% of white, 19% Latino, 13% of Black adolescents in inner city public schools are proficient in math. And I should say that's among 8th graders. Concentration of poverty has produced a population of students with problems few schools are equipped to handle. Survey indicated that 10% of U.S. American high school students did not go to school due to fear of victimization. Administrative bureaucracies can impede reform. Fewer inner city job opportunities have left students with little incentive to remain in school or put effort into academic pursuits. Some reformers have argued that in order to solve education problems, cannot just simply focus on schools, teachers, and tests, but have to fix the entire context in which children live/developed. So kind of you can see here, even the most high performing racial group is U.S. Asian Americans here at 61% proficient in math, which is bad. And then we just range from bad to all the way to worse. And then not only that, kind of this idea of the 1960s, a big era where, so many racial injustices were fixed. Hell, maybe some class issues were fixed, something along those lines as well. Well, it turns out, well, the gap between achievement and education basically the same since it was from the 1960s, which suggests structural issues have been unresolved. Then there is a debate of what those structural issues are and then what you should do about them. But what we do know is that that poverty has created basically a extremely at-risk adolescent group for obvious reasons: lack of social support, lack of material support, massive accumulation of trauma constantly. So, for example, as stated, 10% of U.S. American high school students do not go to school due to victimization. So these are literally just fear of violence. These are things that the school cannot immediately control. So it's like, okay, that student, those students who are skipping school probably less likely to do well on standardized tests. And then the question is, okay, do you punish the school or what do you do about this? But you also have to take in kind of the perspective of the student. So it's like, okay, why am I going to go to school? Look around. There's not a lot of chances for kind of like a social mobility. Can't really move up that ladder in life. There's really nothing going on around you. It looks hopeless. No one individual is going to be able to fix that. As we've seen, like schools can't even like do it. There's really no hope coming. Again, this has been an issue for decades, hundreds of years. And so then it's like, okay, well, as a child, and then the child's not really exactly thinking in those terms. They're just like, listen, the world around me has little like opportunities. Therefore, what is my incentive to continue this? Then you're going to combine with all kinds of other just adversity within that environment, obviously is going to contribute to kind of underperformance of students. And thus, kind of the idea here is, yes, sure, schools can be approved, sure, whatever, theoretically, yes. But at the same time, a part of that overall package has to be like addressing neighborhoods, economic kind of prospects, social support, all those kind of things that are correlated with student outcomes, which spill over into a school setting. Social organization of schools. Large schools have a more varied curriculum and more diverse extracurricular activities. They just have more resources. They have more athletic teams, clubs, organizations. Student performance is higher in more intimate schools, so they have higher feelings of belonging in community, a sense of community. It's estimated that around 400 students belonging declines. Academic marginal students are outsiders in bigger schools. More inequality of education experience exists in larger schools. Children get sorted into, quote, tracks, often stay in those tracks throughout their educational career. Smaller schools, everyone gets the same curriculum. Smaller school size encourages participation, thus developing skills and abilities. Larger schools are more likely to be an observer than participate. Smaller school students are more likely to hold leadership positions, do things that make them feel confident and diligent. Student to teacher ratio matters, less student victimization, more intimacy. So kind of we can see here that at larger schools, kind of straightforward, it's larger, you have more, and at the same time you have more resources. So thus you can offer a variety of courses that may be spark student interest in particular topics or just kind of a sense of interest in pursuing their academic or whatever, succeeding in a school setting. So more economic research, but at the same allowing for more courses, but at the same time having more organizations, more clubs, more athletic teams, just things for students to get involved with, which kind of increases their likelihood of graduating from high school and performing well in high school. But at the same time, we have kind of plus or minuses here, with maybe a sense of belonging and that intimacy and that sense of community dipping after a school reaches a certain number of students, because you basically just have so many students. It can be overwhelming. You're more anonymous, and you can kind of just slip through the cracks of kind of school because there's so many students. But not only that, so although there is a more varied curriculum, not everyone is really going to get access to it. It's going to be typically students who already come from high-achieving student family backgrounds. So kind of students who have had to face kind of less adversity in their lives, have more kind of social and material resources at home, those students are more likely to take those courses and succeed in those courses. So really what you're doing is you're raising the ceiling, but at the same time you still have a lot of students kind of left behind, or at least not in those kind of more kind of sophisticated courses. So thus kind of the gap between the lowest students and the highest students is going to be larger in those larger schools. First is kind of more smaller schools, because more or less everyone's getting the same curriculum. You're all basically going to take more or less the same classes, and thus everybody's kind of like getting that same curriculum. Smaller schools also allow maybe for a little more intimacy, maybe development of social skills, and kind of lower student to teacher ratio. So maybe a little more monitoring from teachers to kind of identify students who are at risk of various negative developmental outcomes. Class size. Research findings have been misinterpreted a little bit, and it's a little more ambiguous than we previously thought. School size is not often a strong predictor of student outcomes. Could engage in less peer-to-peer learning. Outside support systems are unchanged by class size, and thus larger structural issues tend to be more predictive. As class sizes get larger, teachers tend to modify the lesson plan due to time constraints, 30 to 40 students estimated. Tutoring and highly individualized instruction is exceptional. Remedial classes, students who need increased one-on-one time. So all this is basically saying is that although class size may be a predictor of student outcomes, it is not the strongest predictor or a super strong predictor. Why is that? Because other things that we've already talked about, larger macro issues. Is that student from a family who are all previously high school dropouts? Are they from a non-wealthy family? Are they super stressed out in the home? Do they have that accumulation of trauma going on? All those kind of things are larger predictors than just the classroom setting or just the classroom size itself. So again, kind of going back to the other points, you kind of need a holistic solution here. But one kind of thing that does happen is that once class sizes do get very large, teachers modify their lesson plan, and kind of just due to literally a lot of reasons, but just time constraints is one. So it's like, okay, I literally don't have time to grade 50 students' essays. So I can't assign an essay every single week. We can't really practice certain assignments because the class is so large. Literally, I don't have time to deal with this without losing my mind. I'm already like grinding this thing out. So thus, I'm going to have to adjust my curriculum, which could have negative impacts. Now, class size definitely can matter for students who need kind of like more one-on-one individual tutoring. So kind of a smaller class size can be useful there. And for other students as well, I'm just saying that, there are, like all these kind of things, there's not just a single developmental predictor of an outcome in this case. It's not just class size, but all kinds of other issues associated, social, political, and economic issues, contributing to negative student outcomes or learning throughout high school or secondary school. Age grouping, and all we have here is basically that in early 20th century we separated students into either elementary school up to like 8th grades maybe or 6th grades, and then secondary school for 4 or 6 grades. So basically it used to be only 2 schools, like elementary school and then secondary school, and that was it. Eventually we created middle schools, kind of depending on the school, on what state you live in, typically around 6th to 8th grade, so kind of to group those students off into their own school. This kind of dichotomy of how you sort students is less predictive than kind of the overall quality of school in predicting student outcomes. So basically what all this is saying is that all those other kind of background issues that we've already just talked about are more predictive of student outcomes than this kind of dichotomy of, oh, should we just have elementary school and secondary school, or should we also include middle school? As children move into middle school or junior high school, their grades, school engagement, and academic motivation drops. It suggests that a drop in grades reflects changes in student motivation and grading practices. Emphasis on grading / a decline in creativity. The drop in academic motivation and achievement could be due to school transition itself or to the nature of differences between elementary school and middle or junior high school. Students report that between 6th and 8th grade, there is a drop in how supportive teachers and classmates are, how much autonomy students have, and how fair rules are. It contributes to a mismatch in students' needs / desires in school structures. contribute to many adolescents disengaging. So basically what we see here is that as children advance through their school career in the U.S., we see a decline in school engagement and motivation, really. This suggests that something is going on in the school setting, or just kind of like our general culture related to education during that time period. So kind of like our general approach, our design of school at like a macro level, kind of contributing to trickling down to students and impacting students by decreasing their motivation and kind of declines in school grades. Some of the reasons could be due to kind of, again, an increase in like, really that's around the age, it's a little earlier now, but that's really around the age where you really get into that mindset of like standardized testing. You kind of lose a little autonomy and creativity in the classroom because, you know, you have to make sure that you pass kind of those standardized tests. And assignments are now all of a sudden a little bit harder, and teachers in larger class sizes and all kinds of other dynamics going on have a little less opportunity to be supportive and kind of do that one-on-one instructions work. So you have this combination of like, theoretically, you're looking for more autonomy during this age, not always cross-culturally, variation here, but kind of trying to express your creativity a little bit, but at the same time, you're kind of being throttled a little bit. Being like basically participating in academic achievements that are kind of the opposite. You're really just focused on the grade or achieving kind of some level of passing a standardized test rather than creativity and autonomy. Thus, kind of a mismatch between student desires and kind of the structure of the way that we structure schools, maybe contributing to kind of saying, well, if this is what school is, screw it. I don't get to kind of engage in these things that I like to do. Screw it. I'm not going to participate. I'm going to do the bare minimum, and that's just going to be my solution. We also see that expectations for success and self-perception of competence declines during middle school or junior high school, become increasingly concerned about academic outcomes and reinforcement than intrinsic satisfaction in achieving greater competence. Students with more risk factors show a steady decline regardless of their IQ test scores. Higher levels of academic achievement can be promoted by emphasizing a growth mindset throughout adolescence. So kind of we see not only a decline in motivation, but a decline in expectation for success and kind of our overall self-perception of us. And we see students more hyper-focused on grades rather than learning kind of itself and achieving mastery of something. They are very much focused on something external to them, not the intrinsic kind of satisfaction of learning, but again, grades or performing well on a standardized test. And finally, I just want to point out that even regardless of IQ, you know, you'd be like, oh, this is just IQ or whatever. Even if you have, control IQ statistically, or that is, pick people with the same exact IQ, and then look at children of that kind of same IQ grouping with high amounts of risk factors. So it's basically accumulation of stressors. Those students with high levels of accumulation of stressors are more likely to see a decline in their GPA. Even if so you have one person with, whatever, I'll just make up something. One person with 115 IQ, so two people, I should say, with 115 IQ. One of those have a lot of trauma in their life. The other has no trauma in their life. The kid with more trauma in their life and 115 IQ is far more likely to see a larger decline in their GPA. So this is demonstrating that, again, environment matters in these kind of educational outcomes, specifically here GPA. Learning goals. Believing that ability is a changeable quality and improvement can be, or your abilities can be improved with work, protects students from damaging self-perceptions after failure, and encourages to adapt mastery goals. Growth mindset, aiming to learn new things so they can improve their ability. In the U.S., as children age, they see ability as a fixed trait, and they adopt performance goals. They aim to prove their ability rather than to improve it, and seek to be judged smart rather than dumb. So kind of the idea here is that it's important for students to believe that abilities can be improved. So kind of the idea of growth mindset is that you learn things to improve your abilities and focus more on kind of mastery goals. That is, performing a task in order to learn from it, to grow, not necessarily do one task and then just say, okay, how did I do on that task? And that's all that matters. But rather engaging in a process of learning where maybe the immediate results aren't great, but through time you understand that you can steadily improve. And which brings us to that fixed trait, that ability, that intelligence is a fixed trait phenomenon, wherein as children age in the U.S., they come to see intelligence, ability, educational ability as a fixed trait. And what that means is basically you have it or you don't. It's fixed, it's locked in the stone. You're good at math, you're bad at math. You're good at reading or you're bad at reading. So kind of the idea here is if you believe math to be that way, education to be a fixed trait, or whatever, reading to be a fixed trait, math to be a fixed trait, and you have that mindset, while at the same time you take say you take a reading quiz and then you fail at it, right? Okay. Say so you took the quiz, you failed, and then you have that fixed trait mindset about education. Well, so that basically means, oh, okay, I'm bad at reading. I can't change this because, again, reading is a fixed trait. So kind of what's the point of continuing on with this? Why would I keep trying? I literally, by definition, cannot improve. I cannot grow. So thus, I'm going to stop participating. I'm going to be less motivated to continue to be active, participate in school. And not only that, I'm solely going to focus on either getting a good grade, or some kind of, just a grade kind of in general to prove that I'm smart and not be dumb. Because again, you can't change your ability if you have a fixed trait mindset. So it's because you literally feel like nothing can be approved. You got it or you don't. But it feels bad if you don't got it. So you're going to stop reading, and you're going to constantly try and demonstrate that you do have it, prove that you're smart and not dumb, but at the same time, not focus on mastery goals, not focus on growth. Children with mastery learning goals tend to do better in school than those who adopt fixed mindsets and switch to performance goals. The process of learning is more enjoyable. It satisfies their curiosity. They have higher levels of academic achievement. Children who focus on performance goals because the outcome, the grade, is the goals, not the process of learning. They report higher anxiety, which is negatively associated with achievement. Motivation and achievement is higher when children value a subject. They believe it is important and they are interested in the subject. So for kind of self-evident reasons, adopting a fixed mindset and focusing really on just the end goal, the performance goal, the grade, is associated with negative developmental outcomes, wherein kind of students who focus on mastery goals and learning goals are more likely to have higher levels of academic achievement and kind of more likely to take a little risk-taking with their education. It allows them to satisfy their curiosity because they can do so. Because, hey, if I failed this first time, it's not the end of the world. I can keep trying and improve at this. So I can explore in kind of creative ways, while at the same time, when I inevitably fail, not take it as like a condemnation of me as a person. But on the other hand, if I'm purely focused on performance goals, that is a grade, I'm more likely to have higher anxiety because it's like, oh, this is the one thing I need. This is the one thing that matters. This is it, the end product. Doesn't matter that I'm actually improving or not improving. It's like point blank. Here's how the world works. I got a report card. Boom. These grades are all that matters. Which, ironically, if you have too much high anxiety, you're more likely to have negative academic achievement because basically you're going to be so anxious that you're going to perform worse. And then kind of motivation and achievement, kind of the final point, is that, hey, when students kind of view the material as something that's useful to their lives, that they value on an intrinsic level, they're more likely to succeed at those tasks. Some other cross-cultural comparisons here. Some argue that achievement gaps are rooted in cultural differences about attitudes concerning education and educational practices. Among Asian Americans, they are less likely to believe ability is fixed or inborn and more likely to have a growth mindset. In a study of fifth graders, they were asked to imagine a wizard who would grant them any wish. 70% of the wishes listed by Chinese children had to do with education, while about 10% of the wishes of US American kids were related to education. The most common wish among the 10% of US American kids who discussed wishes related to education was for less schooling. When mothers were asked to state the minimum standard to earn performance satisfaction, U.S. American mothers gave a number considerably lower level than they expected their child to perform. East Asian mothers gave a number considerably higher than the level at which they expected their child to perform. So we kind of have here a couple of things here. We have differences, cross-cultural differences in the likelihood of viewing abilities as fixed or inborn, and then we have this wizard study and we kind of have different priorities among children in kind of wishes of educational priorities. And you can see this if you just ask them what they want to wish for. You can have anything you want in your world. Chinese children in this study were far more likely to report a wish that had to do with educational goals. But not only that, we kind of basically have differences in kind of expectation, where the U.S. American mothers had expectations basically below what they expected their child to perform. So basically in their head they have like, okay, my child is capable of earning a B or something along those lines, and the parents in this study will say, okay, I'll be happy with my child if the child earns a C. So it's like a little bit below the grade in which that they believe their child could reach, aka B. Versus East Asian mothers in this study, they went the opposite way. So, for example, even if they believed their child was just capable of earning a B or expected them to earn a B, they would say, no, my standard is actually an A. So, kind of see a difference between both expecting a B, but on the one hand, East Asian mothers in the study saying, well, I still will only kind of be satisfied by an A, versus kind of U.S. Americans satisfied by a C. Secondary schools differ from elementary schools, which we've already talked about, still building on this. Compared to elementary school teachers, middle school, junior high teachers have the following characteristics. They're less likely to feel confident about their teaching ability. They're less likely to trust their students, more likely to emphasize discipline. They're more likely to believe the students' abilities are fixed. Bureaucratic organization and or the anonymous nature of junior high schools and middle schools may have a negative effect on teachers. Students who attend more personal schools or schools where they are more involved do better than peers in more rigid and more anonymous schools. So kind of the idea here is that we also see, so we have kind of differences in students change, teachers change as well. So both, you'll see both being kind of impacted by kind of shifts of kind of expectations in the structure of a school, and now the teachers are like less confident. And they are also kind of adopting and influenced by kind of that standardization approach that becomes more prevalent during this middle school, junior high school period. So kind of like measuring, start to kind of, one way you can think about is standardized testing. One way that can be interpreted is like you got it or you don't. So they start to believe as well that students' abilities are fixed. And it can contribute to kind of really an idea of kind of just like management of students rather than kind of fostering kind of like growth. Again, kind of rooted in kind of larger structural issues that both students and teachers are kind of like feeling. However, it should be noted that not all students experience the same degree of stress. Students who have more academic and psychosocial problems and fewer economic and social resources before making a school transition have more problems coping with it. This is referred to as cascading effects. Psychologically rich become richer, the poor become poorer. Poor inner city and rural adolescents may be particularly at risk for negative effects of school transitions. Boys, ethnic minority students, and students from poor families are more likely to become disengaged from school. Parental support and involvement are associated with better adjustment during school transitions. Having close friends before and during transition is associated with successful adaptation. Study of low-income Black American students found supportive teachers are also protective. So as everything with development, over and over again, students who are already experiencing academic problems and psychosocial problems in elementary school are more likely to have those problems in junior high school or middle school. And as already discussed, poor racial minorities and understudied rural adolescents who have really lack a ton of there's a whole healthcare crisis in rural U.S. and it's massive underinvestment in rural areas, are also at a higher risk of kind of becoming disengaged while at school during this period. However, as stated, kind of parental support and having kind of close pro-social peers can help kind of buffer the effects of stress, even in those at-risk groups. And as I said kind of before, it's kind of not realistic to expect like, oh, the school is going to solve all the problems of this entire community and all these students, because there's a lot of factors that go into their life. But at the same time, very supportive teachers have been found to contribute or decrease these kind of stressful transitions across all at-risk populations. And here the study looking at Black American students. So yes, teachers can obviously have a positive effect, but it's just an uphill battle. Tracking. Practice of separating students into ability groups so that they take classes with peers at the same level. Some critiques include remedial track students generally receive poor quality education, not just different education. They get sorted into classes where the material is less engaging and challenging. Black U.S. Americans are more likely to be in lower track math courses even after controlling for student math ability. Socialize only with peers from same track because schools impact friend choices. Create differing subgroups who are socially hostile to each other. The pro arguments include allows teacher to design class lessons that are more finely tuned to students' abilities, and it might not matter at all anyway. What matters is higher resource students pressuring school to put children in more demanding, more engaging courses. All right, so we have tracking. So basically the idea here is to identify students who are falling behind and their academic performance, and then group them together into a classroom and with other peers who are struggling. So in the best hypothetical sense, a school recognizes that a student or groups of students are underperforming. They then identify those students and then say, oh, we are now going to allocate resources to this person, place them in kind of a classroom wherein we can fine-tune the curriculum to their current like skill level, and basically then catch them up to the rest of their peers. Some critiques of that include that really what happens is that you're basically just you do track and identify students who are underperforming, but you're basically putting them all into a class together, and then they're not receiving the same or even a better education as before, but rather a overall lower quality of education, because the classes are then even less creative, less engaging, less challenging. You're purely teaching them to kind of just get to a minimum skill level and really just warehousing them basically into a group together, and you're going to keep them in that group together throughout their high school or their secondary school career. So basically they're actually receiving a lower quality education. And not only that, but classic discrimination exists, wherein Black U.S. American students, historically disenfranchised populations, just overall more likely to be put in kind of lower track courses, even though they have the exact same math score as their peer. So if you're have whatever, just hypothetically some math score, a black student has it, a white student has it, black student is more likely to end up in track kind of learning. AKA this again, but and as I just stated, that can those courses kind of less engaging, poor quality. At the same time, you're putting all those students together, those lower track students together, and they're most likely going to have lower social skills, less likely kind of to engage, more likely to kind of engage in antisocial behavior. So basically, again, you're clumping the most at-risk students together, which can then they can feed off each other and kind of really actually socially reciprocate those underperformance, and does kind of exacerbate the problem. Also kind of create a separate groups of students, wherein you kind of have the group of remedial students who are going to understand that they're in remedial courses, and then maybe they'll hold resentment, negativity towards their peers, and thus can create like a social hostility. And then obviously the argument is, no, we're going to put them into different classes, and then we can fine-tune the curriculum to the students' abilities. And they also kind of argue that, well, it really might not even matter anyway, because although, yes, some students do get put into these tracking scenarios where there is a kind of challenging, there can be negative outcomes associated with it. Well, it doesn't really matter, because ultimately some students who already basically had higher resources are going to get out of it anyway. So basically the idea here is that if you get a student gets into tracking remedial classes, students who have wealthier families, are more likely, more social resources, come from non-racial minority communities, aka white Americans, middle-class Americans. Those parents are more likely to put pressure on the school, basically, and say, hey, get my student out of these remedial classes, put my student in XYZ class with XYZ teacher. So there is ways that you can get out of kind of this tracking program, but it's usually people who already had higher resources who are able to get out. So again, kind of bringing in that background information and that background history, I should say, those resources that a student has outside of school setting can contribute to literally what classes they end up in. However, overall, it is difficult to get out of this tracking system. One reason why is because they're going to have a different kind of like period schedule, or not period schedule, but kind of the order of their classes are going to be a little different. So basically what happens is if you have one remedial class, it's going to impact your scheduling of other courses because of scheduling conflicts. So what ends up happening is then now you're more likely to end up in kind of less engaging courses or other remedial courses, because there's basically no other classes available, because you have a conflict of schedule, because the schedules of remedial students, whatever, math, English, whatever, a sequence is often different than the non-tracked students. So just one specific example, say I take remedial English, and at the same time that I take remedial English, that's the only time that some kind of advanced math course is taken. Well, I have to take remedial English. Now I can't take that advanced math class, even if hypothetically I am good at math and just maybe remedial in English. However, there are different kind of forms of tracking, such as advanced tracking. So this is kind of tracking for like high achieving students. And these settings, the challenging, there's more challenging instruction, typically just better overall teaching. Critical thinking skills are emphasized. There's less emphasis, however, on rote memorization. Thus, the more advanced track is positively associated with school achievement. So basically, the net effect here is an increase in pre-existing academic, class, power, racial, disability differences. There are some exceptions, however, with lower tracks taught by exceptional teachers. So kind of the idea here is if you identify children or tracked children that are already high performing and put them in like whatever special classes, those classes have higher educational content. They're more engaging, more critical thinking, more resources, less memorization, and thus you're basically taking already advantaged students and just making them more advantaged. So you're just basically increasing pre-existing differences among the whatever disenfranchised groups. And teachers also may engage in some kind of informal tracking system, wherein this can result in raised expectation and evaluations for high ability students and lowered expectations and evaluation for low ability students. So basically, teachers are obviously going to recognize, oh, the student isn't probably doing that well in class, therefore I'm going to lower my expectation for that student. I'm going to evaluate them differently than I do my higher ability students. So it's kind of even maybe within the kind of the same classroom, kind of the students kind of getting a little bit different curriculum. It definitely is. So you can imagine a teacher teaching two different classes, one a little higher performing, one a little lower, and kind of teaching a little differently because of that. But even maybe within even the same classroom setting, with targeting high or kind of putting higher expectations and evaluating high achieving students more positively than lower achieving students, which again can kind of exacerbate these differences. So basically, you have a lot of basically individual actors in real time, very constrained, with a lot of things going on, very control. Within kind of those studies suggesting that these kind of systems don't work that great, and just kind of trying to make these decisions in real time the best that they can, which can have negative outcomes. So I want to jump to mainstreaming a little bit here. The integration of adolescents who have learning disabilities into a single classroom with everyone, sort students into specialized one-on-one attention on one hand, but on the other, social isolation. Stigmatizations argue that the psychological cost of separation outweighs the potential academic benefits. A study of gifted adolescents found higher levels of positive academic self-conceptions than those assigned to special classes. So this is basically a discussion of like disabled students. Should you place them into their own separate classrooms, or should you integrate them, mainstream them with in the same school, but also kind of the same background or in the same classroom? So kind of on the one hand, theoretically, you can separate students into kind of different classrooms and then give them specialized one-on-one care. Thus maybe identify disabilities and then design classrooms in ways that allow disabled students to reach their maximum, developmental potential. So theoretically, but on the other hand, it's like, well, if you do that, aren't you kind of socially isolating disabled students from their peers, and also at the same time maybe developing a stigmatization associated with having a disability? So kind of a debate of how you balance that, or is there another approach, the way to handle this? So these are kind of just a couple of challenges. And kind of the bottom bullet point, kind of this gifted adolescence, kind of demonstrating this social isolation point, or kind of like, I should say that when disabled students are kind of isolated from their peers, it's not like they don't recognize this. It's like, I am now isolated, and because they're just teenagers like everyone else, are like, it doesn't feel bad. Like, I'm going to have maybe a negative self-conception now, or self-evaluation of myself. There could be psychological costs. So in this case here, a little different, but like adolescents who are sorted as gifted or classified as gifted. This study found that gifted adolescents who attended just kind of typical classroom, typical courses, as their peers, their non-gifted peers, aka they didn't have special classes, they just took the same class as everyone else, they had higher levels of self-conception than those gifted adolescents who went kind of separated themselves into kind of their own specialized courses, which again could be demonstrating kind of the social cost of separating groups from each other during adolescence. While on the other, but of course for disabled individuals, much more historically disenfranchised and much more stigma associated with being disabled. Jumping ahead to ADHD, psychological disorder characterized by impulsivity, inattentiveness, I should say, and restlessness. These behavioral manifestations often show in school settings. It's linked to genetics, smoking, drinking during pregnancy, low birth weight, and ACEs/childhood adversity. 3 subtypes exist. That is predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive/impulsive, and combined. ADHD can be understood as existing on a continuum. 2 boys for every girls are diagnosed with ADHD or with this disorder. Girls are underdiagnosed because they show inattention rather than the more easily observable hyperactivity behavior that boys are more likely to show. These differences in prevalence, however, do not continue in adulthood. Frequently treated with stimulant medication. One concern is that the medication is shared with non-diagnosed friends. They use it to perform better on tests and more likely to occur in affluent settings. So kind of like one discussion about this is how should classrooms be designed for children with ADHD? Should you socially teach them to sit still in their their desk or whatever? Should you give them a little more free time at recess, a little more leeway in the class? I don't know. So kind of the structure of the classroom. This debate can, or this this topic can lead to. One thing I want to point out really here is that the differences between boys and girls, kind of the idea here is classically, and you also see this with autism, but different disorder, but still a similar idea here is that boys being more likely to be diagnosed than girls. This is typically just rooted in social reasons. Girls show different kind of signs of ADHD on average. This can be partly due to like gender norms and thus kind of different behavioral manifestations of this disorder. So kind of more likely to show inattention versus boys more likely to like show hyperactivity. So they're more disruptive. So those boys are more likely to be flagged versus kind of the girl just kind of like daydreaming. Also, again, going back to the gender point and stuff like masking or something, if you want to look into, again, not immediate like one-to-one correlation, but a little bit similar to like masking and autism, if you want to look that up, kind of contributing to the behaviors associated with boys and girls, which then basically boys' behaviors with boys' expression of this disorder, behavioral expressions, are more identifiable and thus are kind of more likely to be diagnosed. Now, interestingly, though, support for this idea is that once you hit adulthood, the differences in rates of ADHD diagnosis between boys and girls, and in that case men and women, kind of level off, they come flat, much more equal, which is suggesting that there's some kind of social kind of thing underlying this diagnosis. One kind of common issue with this is this sharing of stimulants, especially kind of in like college settings, but also kind of like upper high school when you're kind of taking standardized tests or maybe taking SAT, ACT, all those kind of things. So you feel like you gotta do very well on this. There's a lot of pressure. So you definitely can see this in kind of like affluent settings where you're kind of like striving, the upper middle class striving towards to do well on standardized tests so then you can get into a university and make your parents happy or whatever. Segregation. U.S. Supreme Court rulings legally ended segregation of schools. Brown v. Board of Education, 54-55. Desegregation has little impact on achievement levels of either minority or white adolescents. This might be related to racial minorities being disproportionately represented among poor, a non-official segregation, capital/white flight. Minority youngsters' self-esteem is higher when they attend schools in which they are in the majority. Students in general feel stronger attachment to schools that draw directly from the community. Students feel more engaged, safer, less lonely, and less harassed in relatively more diverse multi-ethnic schools than less balanced schools. One potential issue with busing children from support systems. Constraints. If school outcomes are community-based, this would suggest building of communities. Cross-ethnic friendships are more common among male than female students, in part because males are more likely to be involved in athletics. So here, again, you see an impact of like the historical area you live in and kind of, again, macro, law, politics impacting adolescent development. In this case, literally segregation of schools, ending, formally, constitutionally in the mid-1950s. However, the kind of achievement gaps, as we talked about before, have continued to persist, I should say. One reason for this is because minorities are overrepresented in kind of lower class strata, and thus there's kind of a non-official segregation going on, wherein the poor areas are more likely to be racial minorities and disabled, and thus kind of the idea here is, again, you have a non-official segregation. One reason for this is because what's referred to as capital/white flight. So basically during desegregation, I should say, people who lived within desegregated schooling areas, they left. They went to private schools, and white people, I mean, like upper class, like middle class, upper middle class kind of area, white Americans basically left that area and said, I'm taking my money, I'm taking my resources with me, I'm going to go to a better school, aka disproportionately a whiter school. So basically so kind of with those resources stripped out of the community, you're left with like a overrepresentative or disproportionate racial minority group, and just overall poor group. Poor whites were also left behind. And kind of that concentration, that capital flight, kind of contributing to, again, concentration, so poverty, contributing to kind of the worst student outcomes among some groups of students. And then the only other thing I want to point out here is kind of like the busing situation. So then the idea is like, okay, I'm going to bus students from one neighborhood to another, but then that could be a little risky. It's obvious for self-evident reasons. It's like, okay, yes, I want to access schools who have more resources because, again, that capital was removed from the community. But at the same time, doing so, you could be placing those students in kind of adverse circumstances because they're kind of losing their community support because literally they're outside their community. Maybe feel a little more lonely, a little more less connected to the school because they're a huge racial minority, and frankly, discrimination still kind of exists. So then the question is, of course, okay, so why don't you just like kind of build up the communities of these poorer communities, which then obviously is a political ideological question. And we've already touched on most of this. Kind of jumping to the second bullet point, government subsidized school vouchers allows parents to purchase education at a school of one's choosing, private or public. But again, this can create capital flight concerns, wherein basically the higher class students will leave the at-risk schools and just populate in like really good private or public schools, and then leave behind the low resource students. And then homeschool adolescents with weak religious ties are 3 times more likely to be behind a grade level, half as likely to do extracurriculars, kind of straightforward. You're schooling from home, so you're less likely to kind of be involved in those other peer school-based extracurricular activities, and you're more likely to be a grade behind because your parent most likely not be able to teach in a whole array, like a whole variety of courses, English, math, whatever, like all the subjects you have to take, social sciences, all these kind of things. Your parents most likely not going to be an expert in all those fields, thus kind of contributing to kind of lower academic achievement. And then the final point, which we've already talked about numerous times, is that family background is highly predictive of student outcomes, social capital, interpersonal resources available to the adolescent or family. So again, kind of the resources you bring to the table are a very strong predictor of academic achievement. Research suggests that the best classroom climate for adolescents are responsive and demanding, positive with supportive and demanding teachers. Attending a school with a positive climate helps protect/buffer from the adverse consequences of exposure to violence and poverty. A moderate degree of structure, cooperative, not competition between students, and positive relationship with teachers. They provide clear feedback about expectations and praises associated with more positive outcomes. How many teachers students have a positive relationship with is a strong predictor of enjoyment of going to school. Firm, supportive, well-defined standards. More mastery goals. When students trust teachers, discipline is far more likely to result in changed behaviors. So kind of strong classroom environments are responsive to student needs. They recognize student needs, but at the same time, they have high standards. They have standards that a child has to meet, and those standards are kind of demanding. But at the same time, kind of understanding kind of a mastery set of goals. We're working our way to those high standards, and we are going to support you along the way. And not only that, but we're going to focus on cooperation. Kind of like we're a team here in this classroom. It's not a competition between you and me or you versus your peer, but rather, again, kind of a cooperative learning environment where we're kind of helping each other out. And this can kind of help decrease social comparison. So you like looking at your peers who's like achieving more than you and thinking, oh, wow, they're way better than me. I suck. I'm going to stop trying. So it's kind of trying to prevent or decrease that social comparison. And adolescents, students who have or the more positive connections a student has to teachers, the more likely they are to have positive academic outcomes. It's basically a sense that positive teacher interaction, that connection, that positive social connection with their teacher, kind of increases a sense of community, a sense of belonging, that someone cares about you, and you're also kind of receiving kind of like one-on-one interaction with theoretically a positive adult. So kind of like parenting. Teaching isn't not just in the classroom, a formal setting, but kind of one-on-one communication about life lessons, the world, whatever. It also allows for just literally just practicing like social skills, confidant, all those kind of things. And kind of once you kind of have a high degree or a relatively high amount of strong connections to teachers, but not only that, but just kind of you trust teachers in general. Again, we're in a cooperative learning environment. I'm interested in your learning. We're all in it together. We have standards. We're not just screwing around here, but we're all working towards that standards in a positive way. Those are the cases when discipline is more likely to change behaviors of students, because the student has buy-in. They believe in the school. They believe that you care about them. And thus are kind of more likely to well, they're going to have a different understanding of, hey, this person is not critiquing me because they hate me or they're out to get me, but rather they care about me, and this is kind of a part of growth. There's a strong correlation between teacher expectations and students' performance because of teachers' expectations. They are often accurate reflections of their students' abilities, which explains about 80% of the correlation between teacher expectations and student performance. It also creates self-fulfilling prophecies, which explains about 20% of the correlation. This accumulates over time, lowering the performance of students whose teachers perceive them as less capable than they actually are. So we have basically a strong correlation here between expectations and performance. And basically this study said about 80% of that is kind of accurate. So basically the idea is, yes, teachers are going to have a general understanding of where a student's ability is, and kind of theoretically what ability they, or what their expectations should be based on that ability. But also 20% of it in this study, the idea here is self-fulfilling prophecies. So kind of the idea here is that teachers are misjudging a student's potential ability, and thus kind of saying to a student, consciously or unconsciously, which we'll talk about momentarily, that, hey, you're not that good, and I really don't have that much expectations for you. Well, the student will recognize this on some level and create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So even though they actually not be bad at math or whatever, but if their teacher is kind of treating them with kind of lower expectations than other peers, which they can pick up on, then they're going to start acting in ways consistent with that teacher's evaluation of underperformance or lower ability in math. So it's kind of that expectation by the teacher is kind of internalized by the student. Students may consciously or unconsciously base their expectations on student performance in part on students' ethnic background and family wealth. They call on affluent or white students more. Teachers have lower expectations on average and hold stereotypes about Black and Latino students. Teachers have higher expectations of minorities when schools have more interracial interaction. Teachers give undeserved positive feedback to Black and Latino students who have done poor work. Students report that they perceive their teenagers as having lower expectations. When minority students perceive less discrimination, they perform better and are more engaged, making it difficult for lower class or minority students to attain academic accomplishments that permit upward mobility. This can contribute to student alienation and intra-student tension. A study of lower class students found that parental high expectations help protect against lower school expectations. High achievement expectations from parents helps protect students from the impact of low teacher expectations. All right, so we have so teachers again exist in the social world. They are consciously and unconsciously understanding that some students are underachieving, are achieving at appropriate levels, and then they're kind of behaving in ways consistent with that understanding. And guess what? Again, we've already talked about those students who are in lower classes and racial minority groups are more going to be overrepresentative in kind of underperformance in school settings. And this is really kind of how one way you can see kind of almost two curriculums, different curriculums even within the same classrooms. So teachers being more likely to call on affluent or white students, having a higher likelihood of holding stereotypes and lower expectations for racial minority students. However, again, kind of a cultural or a contextual variation here, wherein teachers have higher expectations for minorities, racial minority students, when they have more interracial interaction. So this can almost be conceptual as like an in-group, out-group thing that we were talking about before. So whatever you are now interacting with other races, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe some of these stereotypes I hold are actually incorrect. Therefore, I should treat these students like other students and give them the same expectations and demands as other students who whatever are from the same race as me or the same class as me. But it's not just about expectations. So, but also like the feedback that's given. So feedback in general is just limited, point blank across the board for everyone in school. But even among positive feedback, if a student kind of recognizes, this teacher doesn't really think I can do much in my life, this kind of the form of feedback that's given can be kind of seen as like patronizing. Because it's like, okay, one, you really don't think this, and also you're like praising me for putting a period at the end of my sentence. Like this is, again, patronizing, and now I'm kind of less likely to want to engage in this. However, again, when kind of straightforward, when minority students have teachers who perceive their teachers as not being discriminatory, not holding stereotypes, they are going to perform better and be more engaged for kind of self-evident reasons. But you can have that again sense of positive student-teacher interactions, that positive social bond, that sense of belonging again, which is going to be associated across all races with a higher performance. It should also be noted, though, that although teachers have certain expectations, the role of parental expectations also plays a role and can kind of offset maybe lower teacher expectations. However, student engagement is also very important. This is because students and teachers influence each other. It's bidirectional. Teachers can help engage students, and student excitement makes teachers more engaging. So you can think of this like parents. So yes, parents impact the child, but also the child impacts the parent. It's kind of the same idea here, is bidirectional. So the class is out of control, chaos, whatever, and it might not even be related to that immediate teacher. Again, this could be like a very at-risk student. Maybe the school is way underfunded, not enough books in the classroom, just all kinds of risk factors accumulating, and boom, now all of a sudden you have a teacher who has great intentions, they're in this classroom, and the students are just going wild. Like it's chaos, and now the teacher's stressed out, and then the teacher now is going to be like, no, everything has to be rigid, we're only teaching to the test, no more creativity, less rights, blah, and then it's, and then the students recognize that, they don't like it, they act out worse, that affects the teacher, and then around and around we go. So again, it's important to recognize that teachers also human beings, and they're existing in this context. And even if they recognize, like, hey, it's not these students' fault, it's these other macro issues, but it still can take a toll on you through time. Especially when often, teachers are kind of like blamed for all the issues with students, which again, we've talked about. It's related not just to the immediate teacher, but also these larger issues that are typically the strongest predictors of outcomes and beyond the teacher's control. Student engagement, the extent to which students are psychologically committed to learning and mastering the material rather than simply completing the assigned work. Student disengagement comes in many forms, including behavioral, emotional, and cognitive. Enhances mental health, protects against family problems, stress, and victimization. Student disengagement, emotional or physical. Checking out, cascading effects. Someone who starts to feel disconnected from school is more likely to start skipping school, which increases the risk of losing interest. Student engagement in 9th grade is predictive of high school dropout rates, depression, and college attendance likelihood. So student engagement and to kind of focus on mastering and learning, not just like getting the grade, which again kind of frankly related to like a cheating epidemic. It's because we don't really care. It's like, oh, I just got to get the grades so I can move on with my life. So students who are more committed to kind of like mastery of material are more likely to have positive mental health outcomes, and it could protect against that kind of focus on growth and just overall engagement in your social setting in like pro-social ways can help protect against family problems and stress and decrease the likelihood that they're victimized. But however, once disengagement happens, both emotionally and physically, those two kind of forms of disengagement can, again, socially reinforce each other. They reciprocate each other. So kind of, again, mapping out that scenario, say like, I'm alienated with school. I'm disconnected with school. This is all worthless. I'm or maybe I even think it is good, but it's just like I can't do it. I'm not going to engage with school anymore. On like a cognitive level. So even though I'm attending school, I'm not like, mentally there. Well, eventually what happens is like, well, screw it. I'm not even going to physically show up. So kind of again, you can see how that emotional, that psychological checkout can contribute to eventually just saying, screw it. I'm going to start skipping school. And then once you start skipping school, you lose even more kind of connection, community, interest in school, which then again, you're rolling downhill at that point. And that is kind of one reason why student engagement in ninth grade is going to predict your likelihood of depression and high school dropout rates. Because you can have, once you have that cascading effects, unless there's some kind of intervention, it can be quite hard for kind of students to break out of that negative cycle. Routine, rigid structure of most classrooms in which teachers lecture students rather than engage them in discussion is associated with alienation from school and undermines kind of academic achievement desire. Even in high-achieving students, about 2/3 report they are not fully engaged. They work hard, but don't enjoy it. This is associated with stress, depression, aggression, headaches, and exhaustion. Students were more likely to engage with schoolwork when it is authentic. That is, it's challenging, fun, and relevant to real-world problems. This increases their feelings of belongingness. Making connections between science learned in quote-unquote the real-world use is associated with improvements in engagement and achievement in students with lower expectations. So we've already talked about kind of like shifts and how routine schools become around that middle school area as you continue on to high school. Much more rigid structure, much more kind of like teaching to a test, less creativity. This impacts students. And that kind of, in the absence of that kind of engagement, because you really do have to kind of lecture a lot to kind of get through all that material, in the absence of kind of that engagement with students, that discussion, that can undermine kind of willingness to keep participating in school, because you're kind of just alienated, you're disconnected from the lecturer, you're just listening to someone, you're a passive recipient of knowledge rather than kind of interacting actively with the material. And even students who are able to kind of navigate this and still achieve, they still report that they're not fully engaged. So they're kind of doing the work, but they're not enjoying it at all, which is really not a great thing, as you can see, associated with numerous negative outcomes. And even or I should say, when school classrooms or materials really associated with kind of authentic, real-world, fun, but still challenging, again, maintaining a standard, it's not just like movie day, and kind of relevant to quote-unquote real-world problems, students are more likely to engage with that material, find that material interesting, and kind of, again, that sense of belonging. Like or as a teacher or as a student, you're talking about real-world problems that theoretically apply both to the student and the teacher or the students alone, whatever. But ultimately, it's like, hey, it's an identification of like what's going on in the world and something that is now directly relevant to my world. So a way of interpreting my world in new and interesting ways, contributing to the sense that, hey, we're all in this kind of together. I have now a sense of belonging, a social commitment to this person who cares about me, who understands my issues. Their issues are similar or the same as mine, or that person understands it. So we're kind of have some kind of a camaraderie, that is increases the likelihood of kind of student persistence and engagement. And you see this even in students who have kind of lower expectations about schooling and maybe underperforming students as well. The peer groups of students' supports, values, and norms also exert an important influence on student outcomes and student engagement. Adolescents whose friends support academic achievements are more likely to feel connected to school. Students whose parents are involved in school activities, who encourage and emphasize academic success, and who use authoritative parenting practices do better in secondary schools than their peers. Involvement in extracurricular activities increase attachment to school. Overextending can harm student performance, however. Students' engagement is also predicted by their thinking of the economy and job market. So students are more likely to persist academically, be more motivated to succeed academically when their peers do as well. So now you have, again, social reciprocal process wherein your peers are engaging and committed to school, and now you're communicating with that person, interacting with them, you're more likely to participate in those same behaviors and adopt those kind of same mindset. And then you can see the impact of parents, wherein those parents were involved in their kind of child's their students or whatever, their child's academic performance, their child's school, and emphasize the importance of academic success, are more likely to do well than children from uninvolved parents. However, it is important to note that although involvement in extracurriculars does increase attachment to school, there is kind of a limit wherein I want my kid to be in every extracurricular. They're working round the clock. They're in all the AP courses. Well, that kind of overextending adolescence can have a negative impact just from like extreme kind of stress. And maybe contribute also to the likelihood of developing performance goals, and that's like maybe they fail one time and then it's just like a free fall, and that can be problematic. And then we have this job market point, which I've already kind of touched base on, but kind of the idea here is that students aren't dumb, okay? They understand, they look at the world around them. They may not understand like the historical reasons, the broad economic reasons, you know, all these kind of things, but they can look around them and say, hey, listen, these prospects for my life, not great. So recognizing their immediate like economic precarity and the potential job market impacts students' willingness to engage, because, hey, who cares if I engage or not in school? Because ultimately, I'm going to end up in the same neighborhood regardless, and there's no future here. So again, students are able to see this, even if they don't have like this deep historical understanding, and frankly, that's how most people operate. They look at the world around them, they interpret it, and based on the world around them, they form certain expectations, which can impact their present-day behavior. School violence. About 1 in 4 U.S. American students have been a victim of violence in and around school, and about 1 in 6 is worried about being physically attacked or hurt while in school. Violence is especially common in middle schools. Some different responses to violence include zero tolerance, a get tough approach to adolescent misbehavior that responds seriously or excessively to the first infraction. Some scholars contend this policy has not helped. Suspending or expelling students increases their likelihood of getting into trouble. Getting police involved places children in a, quote, school to prison pipeline. Police policies, I should say, have a disproportionate impact on black students. Violence reduced when schools/programs attempt to create more humane school climates. School cameras/metal detectors is associated with decreased achievement across all students. So violence obviously happens at schools, and there's different approaches to this. We have the zero tolerance practice, which is fairly prominent, especially in kind of lower achieving schools, poor schools, schools with are disproportionately racial minorities, and some critiques of that include just this school to prison pipeline scenario. So kind of the idea here is for zero tolerance is a child does anything wrong, boom, game over. We're taking it to like an extreme degree of punishment, because the idea here is kind of like the classic like scared straight kind of thing, or where like discipline and punishment is going to reform this, theoretically, you know, in the most positive light, reform these students' behaviors, or at least make them stop doing it, and thus, whatever, they can engage more in school or something along those lines. Some critiques obviously include the school to prison pipeline. So kind of the idea here is, yeah, okay, you're going to do that. You're going to take everything to the nth degree, immediately get police involved. Well, what's going to happen is kind of like how tracking and those kind of unintentional effects of some intervention studies, you're placing these students among other like antisocial peers, other criminals. So you're putting you in prison. So you're basically saying now your socialization process is going to be surrounded by other underdeveloped, under-socialized, antisocial peers, which is just going to, again, socially reinforce those behaviors. Moreover, numerous studies have demonstrated that black students are more likely to receive the harshest penalties associated with zero tolerance. So kind of either the same behavior is more likely to be more punished to a higher extent among black students. and kind of school cameras and metal detectors as a whole across all students are associated with decreased academic achievement. So again, instead, we should be trying to create some kind of a more pro-social school environment and also address other like community, economic, and public policy issues, rather than just punishing a child and saying that's going to, or get them involved in the legal system, and that is going to kind of make them into better students. Continuing on for school violence, lethal school violence, widely publicized and significant, but rare compared to other forms of shootings and violence. Adolescents are more likely to be killed at home or in the community than in the school. Schools are far safer than homes. In communities. A number of school shootings have decreased fourfold since the 1990s. School shootings have returned to pre-COVID levels, and by some accounts have increased, however. School shooters is effectively impossible to predict. So if you pick a bunch of 6th graders and say, which of these people are going to be a school shooter in the 10th grade, it's basically impossible to predict. You can't do it. Most effective policies: limiting access to guns, identifying and treating young people with mental health disorders, creating school climates where students feel responsible for each other and are prepared to take action if they hear/say something. So we have this lethal school violence. Obviously, some caveats here apply. So although school shootings are far, far, far less likely than shootings in homes and communities, it does happen at schools, and that's basically got 2 points. One, is that a great thing that school shootings are more likely to occur in homes and communities? That may be just saying, oh wait, it's really awful there, and it's also a little less awful at schools. So you're just rating levels of basically awfulness. Ultimately is what we're doing here, but ultimately, yes, in your home and communities, you're far more likely to be be a victim of lethal violence than in a school setting. But obviously, it still exists and is obviously disturbing. But the rates overall in kind of the U.S. have declined of violent crime, and this again can be associated with all kinds of theories, including lead, for example. just eating a lot of lead. But some other policies can include, beyond removing other pollutants, which may also be contributing to this, some kind of gun reform or something along those lines. Again, these are all just going to be massively political and social issues. Addressing, ultimately, like all school-related issues, going to be related to things outside of the school, not just the school setting itself, but things well beyond the school, and which will frankly be settled outside of the school setting, beyond potentially making some things worse, like those metal detectors impacting student engagement. But other people would argue that, oh, maybe, yeah, students are less likely to engage, but maybe they're safer, or something along those lines. Moving on to college-bound adolescents, early post-secondary institutions were typically small, private, liberal arts academies, often with strong theological emphasis. A host of other types of institutions eventually developed. Large private universities, technical colleges, professional schools, publicly financed state universities, land-grant colleges, urban universities, and 2-year community colleges. In 1900, only 4% of 18 to 21-year-olds were enrolled in college, but today about 70% of high school graduates will enroll in college. 60% of the population is estimated to be female by 2030, and that is the college population. Financial aid increases and decreases is associated with minority and lower class enrollment rates. American post-secondary education is distinguished by its variety and accessibility. Only about 60% of all U.S. students who enroll in 4-year college complete their degree within 6 years. So again, you can see a historical effect where in 1900, about 4% of 18 to 21-year-olds, aka those are going to be your more well-off, wealthier people, so top 5%-ish. We see, importantly, kind of increases in enrollment in college associated with stemming from, I should say, increased financial aid. So not just student loans, but also like Pell Grants, for example, increasing the likelihood that poor students or disabled students or racial minority students attending college for self-evident reasons. But yet, I should say, only about 60% of all students who enroll in those four-year colleges complete their degree within 6 years. So we do have large amounts of dropout rates. And even if they do graduate, taking much longer than kind of a traditional four-year path. Secondary schools are geared almost exclusively toward the college bound, even though 1/3 of adolescents do not go to college. Opportunities for learning and critical thinking higher in college prep classes than general vocational track courses. Students in vocational or general tracks find that their high schools have not prepared them for the world of work. Young adults without college experience often must make ends meet in minimum wage jobs, which offer little promotion or advancement. It's compounded by increases in prices and are less likely to have a job with healthcare. Rates of depression are significantly higher among adolescents who are neither in school nor steadily employed. Think of merit. If the cream of the crop supposedly always rises to the top, that means people who don't make it are going to feel inferior. It's their fault. All right, let's work our way through this, beginning with our first bullet point about college prep courses. So kind of the idea here is that for college prep courses in general, they're more likely to be engaged in opportunities for like mastery goals, actual learning, less rote memorization, and more critical thinking. So, and then a general vocational track course. Thus, kind of again, even within the same school setting, you can see differences in kind of the curriculum and the skills and the approaches to learning that are embedded within these classes. So kind of a shadow, basically secondary curriculum. And this gets troublesome because at least 1/3 of adolescents are not going to go to college. And as stated before, a ton of adolescents who go to college don't graduate or spend a very long time there. So thus they end up basically having the exact degree equivalent of just like a high school graduate diploma. But really this gets at a larger kind of bigger kind of point here. That culturally, economically, politically, we've kind of centered the country around something called the meritocracy. And you think of merit, like and think about the assumptions built into merit. And that is like, okay, the cream of the crop rise to the top. That ultimately, who's going to make it and who deserves to make it are people who demonstrate their proficiency, their skill sets, who are the actually intelligent people. Schools will be, you work your way through the educational ladder from high school to whatever, AA, bachelor's, master's, PhD, whatever, some other MD degree. But ultimately, if you're good enough, you're going to make it because it's equal opportunity to work your way through education, the great equalizer. Now, what's built into that is the idea of, well, merit, obviously, and the idea that the cream of the crop will rise to the top. If you got it, you'll make it. Thus, it's your fault if you make it, or whatever. If you make it, it's because you're awesome. But if you don't make it, that's on you. That's your fault. You had equal opportunity to education. Now, obviously, that can be interpreting your inability to succeed in college or go to college as a failure that is you cause can have deeply negative effects to a person's understanding of themselves. And it's not just kind of this abstract kind of thing, but like literally, like we use education to socially sort people. So the people who, on average, if you have a high school diploma, you're going to get paid far less than someone who has a master's degree. So we're basically allocating social resources based on educational level. And people kind of understand that on some level. So if you don't make it, through that meritocracy, and again, it is completely your fault because it's merit-based, that's going to have negative repercussions for yourself psychologically, but also materially. You're going to make less money. You're more likely to work in precarious jobs. And it's not just low wages, you're more likely to have jobs that don't have healthcare. In the United States, it's a problem. There's universal healthcare. And then at the same time, maybe price is increasing, your wage isn't increasing, and you're deep precarity, which can have a whole host of negative consequences, not just to yourself, but also how you view society. So how do we deal with this? And frankly, even among the people who have degrees, those people who have degrees, it's not just a complete lock. There's still, precarity is also increasing there. So a generalized increase in precarity, but with it heavily concentrated in kind of lower educational levels, which is contributing to a divide of college and non-college people, of how they feel about themselves and how they feel about the world. What do you do about that? Like all these kind of things, that is a social question, as a political and ideological question that is sorted, that'll be sorted out or not sorted out outside of the immediate classroom setting. With that said, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week.